The vote to delay was unanimous, 29 seats, 0 objections. The glacier had 11 months left to live, and nobody in the room thought that was worth interrupting lunch. Akai Concordance Hall's central chamber was built to seat all 31 member species comfortably, in a design so old it predated half the biology currently sitting in it. The air recyclers hummed at a frequency calibrated for a dozen different respiratory systems at once. The translation relays clicked and murmured continuously, a low tide of overlapping languages beneath every session. High it was, by any measure, an impressive achievement of 5 centuries of careful diplomacy, a room built to make sure everyone could be heard. It had never quite solved the harder problem of making sure everyone actually was. Nobody in that chamber had ever stood on the ice. Inzmalo had, 6 weeks earlier, a EVA suit 2 sizes too big, with frost creeping across her visor, and a woman named Wenna Sale laughing at her for tripping over a coil of cable. Ines still had the recording of that laugh, saved on a drive she hadn't been able to open since. This is the story of how a salvage crew nobody had ever heard of ended up rewriting a 5-century-old treaty, not with a fleet, a armament, not with a threat, but with a piece of scrap metal that everyone else had thrown away. The junior seat, the Aurelian Compact, had governed its corner of the galaxy for 531 years. A 31-member species sat at its long central table, in an order that had nothing to do with alphabet and everything to do with seniority. Humanity's seat, the Terran Assembly's seat, was 58 years old. It sat near the far end, past the water pitchers, past the translator stations, in a spot that got the worst acoustics in the entire chamber. Nobody had ever formally decided to put the newest members where they'd be hardest to hear. It had just worked out that way, the way these things always did. Mirren had an even quieter seat than the humans. They had joined the Compact 11 years before Earth's ambassadors ever set foot in Concordance Hall, and it hadn't helped them at all. A small species rarely got help from seniority. They got help from allies, and allies were exactly what the old accords were designed to make unnecessary. At the center of it all sat the Sustainment Accord, a treaty older than most of the species currently bound by it, built for an era when resource shortages meant civilizational extinction, and someone, somewhere, had decided the fairest answer was central redistribution. In practice, that meant the Continuity Office, a department, a stamp, a calendar full of hearings that moved at the speed of paperwork, administered mostly by a species that had made logistics into something close to a religion. The Kethrali did not conquer, they allocated. There is a difference, and the difference is the entire reason nobody ever declared war on them. For 4 years, the Mirren had been filing the same request with the Continuity Office, over and over, in the same patient language diplomats are trained to use. The Cistern Shelf, the glacial aquifer beneath Thalos Hollow, the only fresh water source for 400,000 Mirren, is drawing down faster than projected. Please authorize an independent survey before extraction quotas are finalized. 11 times, filed 11 times, acknowledged 11 times, tabled for the next session. The Kethrali were not being cruel. That was the maddening part. Administrator Ovran Tal, who ran the regional desk that handled Thalos Hollow, genuinely believed the numbers his office produced. The numbers said the aquifer could sustain a supplemental draw for another 6 standard years before reaching critical depth. The numbers had been correct for the last 40 allocation cycles. There was no reason from where he sat to think this cycle would be different. He was wrong. He would not find out he was wrong until it no longer mattered whose fault it was. High, 3 weeks before the flood, the Mirren ambassador to the compact had stood at that same, acoustically dead end of the chamber and made the same request she had made 11 times before. In language so carefully measured it barely registered as urgency at all, because urgency, delivered too plainly, tended to read as hysteria to delegates who had never once had to worry about where their own water came from. High. She had learned over 4 years exactly how much emotion the room would tolerate before it stopped listening. It was never enough emotion to actually move anyone. It was always exactly enough to be politely acknowledged and quietly filed. "We are not asking for water," she told the chamber that day. "High. We are asking for someone to check whether the number in your model matches the ice we can see cracking with our own eyes." The Kithrali delegate who answered her was not unkind. He thanked her. For her diligence, he noted correctly that the Continuity Office's models had an excellent historical accuracy rate. He suggested the matter be added to the agenda for the next full session. Nobody in that room knew they were looking at the last chance anyone would have to stop what happened next. Myron had built Thales Hollow into something worth protecting in the patient, unglamorous way small species usually do, not with monuments, but with maintenance. 400,000 of them lived across the moon's terraced settlements, drawing every drop of fresh water they used from a single glacial shelf that had taken the previous 2 Mirren generations 40 years to learn how to manage without draining it dry. Hows. There was a whole discipline around it. Water wardens trained for a decade before they were trusted to read the shelf's pressure logs alone. It was, by any honest measure, a masterpiece of small-scale stewardship, the kind of achievement that never makes it into a compact briefing, because briefings are written by people counting fleets, not glaciers. None of that mattered to an allocation model built 5 centuries earlier to answer a different question. The sustainment accord had never been designed to weigh 40 years of careful stewardship against 6 years of projected surplus. It had been designed to move water, minerals, and labor from wherever the model said there was extra to wherever the model said there was need. And the model, like most old and trusted things, had simply never been asked whether it might be wrong about a specific glacier belonging to a specific people who had never had a fleet large enough to make anyone check twice. Ines Marlowe had never heard of the sustainment accord before that spring. She was a salvage engineer, 34 years old, with grease permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles and a business that survived on margins so thin they were practically theoretical. Her ship, a 50-year-old survey retrofit called the Dogwatch, was captained by a woman named Corinne Blake, who had bought the vessel at auction with money she didn't technically have. Found the wreck by accident, the way most good luck arrives. Haben. It was drifting in a debris shadow behind a dead moon in the Coral Expanse, tumbling so slowly it looked like it was thinking about something. Old hull plating, no modern running lights, a design language nobody built in anymore, thick, load-bearing frames instead of smart alloy skin, manual hatches, redundant everything. Dead ship Captain Innes said, running the scan a second time, because the first result seemed impossible. A Terran registry, pre-compact. This thing is 161 years old. Corinne came to stand behind her chair. That old, and it's still holding pressure. Barely, but yeah, they should have logged the coordinates and moved on. Old Terran hulls from before Earth joined the compact were common enough. Most had been stripped for parts decades ago, or lost entirely to the chaos of the early expansion years, when humanity had been alone out here and building things nobody kept proper records of. The salvagers found a few every year. Most were empty shells. This one had a name stenciled on its bow, faded but legible under 3 coats of dust. RSV Waybound. Nobody on the crew recognized it. Nobody had any reason to. The airlock cycle took nearly 4 minutes longer than a modern hull would have needed, by its old mechanical seals groaning through a startup sequence nobody alive had been trained on. When the inner hatch finally opened, the air that met them was bone dry and utterly still, carrying the particular metallic staleness of a space that had not exchanged breath with anyone in over a century. They did not know it yet, but they had just found the only surviving hull from a Terran research initiative called Project Continuum, a program so quietly buried in its own government's records that even the people who authorized its funding had mostly forgotten it existed by the time Earth signed the Compact Charter. 211 engineers had worked on it across 9 years. All 211 had signed documents agreeing never to discuss it with their families. Most of them were dead now and had died without telling anyone what they'd built. What they'd built was still floating out there, waiting. What the water knew when a sail was 41 years old. She had spent 19 of those years as a water warden on Thalos Hollow, which meant she knew the sound the cistern shelf made better than she knew her own daughters' voices, the particular groan of settling ice at dawn, a higher creak that meant a stress fracture was forming somewhere deep in the shelf, a silence that meant everything was fine. She had 2 daughters. Tamsin was 9. The older one worked the Eastern Intake Station and had, that week, finally agreed to let her mother stop worrying so much about the pressure readings on the Western Wall. That morning had been by every measure Wenna cared about a good one. She had walked the ridge above the lower terraces before her shift, the way she did most mornings, watching the light come up pale gold across the ice fields. Tamsin had run ahead of her, counting the frostbirds that nested in the old cargo gantries, keeping score of a competition only she understood the rules to. Wenna had logged the shelf's dawn readings, steady, well within tolerance, exactly where the season said they should be, and had allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to stop thinking about the Western Wall entirely. She had 4 survey requests, still sitting unanswered at the continuity office. She had stopped expecting a response to any of them months ago, the way people eventually stop checking a door they know isn't going to open. It did not mean she had stopped filing them. It meant she had learned to keep living while she waited. The Kayathrali reclamation fleet arrived 4 days ahead of its published schedule. Nobody on Thalos Hollow was told why. Later the official record would call it a logistics optimization. A scheduling adjustment made at the fleet level, 3 tiers above. Anyone who would ever think to ask a Mirren water warden whether an early draw was safe. The extraction ships didn't wait for the seasonal thinning the Mirren engineers had built their entire drawdown model around. They opened the primary intake valve on schedule, according to a calendar that had never once been checked against the shelf's actual structural readings. Wenna felt the shelf scream before her instruments did. She was in the Western Access Tunnel when the pressure spike hit, a sound like the whole moon clearing its throat, and she had 11 seconds, by her own suit's timestamp, to decide what to do with them. Ha! She used every one of them trying to manually seal the intake valve before the fracture reached the lower terraces. She did not make it back out. The last entry in her personal log, time-stamped 90 seconds before the fracture reached the valve housing, was not a message to anyone. It was a pressure reading, dictated out of 19 years of pure habit, even as the tunnel around her began to groan like something enormous, waking up angry. A western wall, holding recalculating drawdown curve, will need to flag this for... The entry ended there. 52 residents of the lower terraces did not reach high ground before the flood front hit. The number would be printed in exactly one compact administrative filing 6 weeks later, under a line item labeled Incidental Population Displacement, Non-Combat. Rescue teams reached the lower terraces within the hour, wading through waist-deep meltwater to pull survivors from collapsed access tunnels and flooded housing blocks. They found 41 people alive. They found the rest too late in the slow, methodical way rescue workers learn to keep moving even after hope has quietly left the job. Wenna Sale's body was recovered from the Western Access Tunnel 2 days later, still 11 meters from the valve she had died trying to close. The Kethrali extraction crew that opened the valve did not know Wenna Sale's name. They did not know she had 2 daughters, or that she had spent 19 years learning to hear a glacier think. They knew a schedule, and a quota, and a green light from a desk 3 systems away. That is not an excuse. It is the entire problem in miniature. News of the Thalos Hollow flood reached Concordance Hall the same day it reached the Dog Watch. Ines heard it on a public relay feed while she was up to her elbows in the Waybound's dead engine bay, trying to figure out why a 161-year-old drive core was still holding a faint charge. But that was not the strangest thing she would learn that week. She almost didn't stop working to listen. Disasters on compact border colonies were a grim kind of background noise if you weren't from there. Then the report mentioned the name of the water source, and something in the old ship's logs she'd been slowly reconstructing clicked into place with an ugliness that made her stomach turn. The Waybound's last logged mission, a century and a half earlier, had been a survey of exactly this kind of situation. A resource system under strain, a population that couldn't defend its own infrastructure. A design brief, buried in a corrupted data core that read, "Build something that does not need to win a war to protect what it's protecting." Ines sat back on her heels in the dark of the engine bay and thought about a woman she had spoken to for exactly 4 minutes, on an open comm channel 6 weeks earlier, requesting landing clearance on a moon called Thalos Hollow. She did not know yet that Wenna Sale was dead. She would find out in 11 hours, and it would change everything about how she read the rest of the ship's logs. The casualty list posted to the public relay feed 11 hours later, in the flat administrative format, the compact used for every disaster, regardless of scale. Names, ages, registered occupation. Ines almost scrolled past it entirely. She had never learned to read Mirren family names on sight. And the list ran to 52 entries, until one line stopped her cold, because it was the only entry with an occupation she recognized. Sale Wenna, age 41, water warden, Western Terraces. She sat with it for a long time. The way you sit with something that refuses to become smaller no matter how long you look at it. 4 minutes on an open comm channel, a joke about her borrowed suit, a laugh that Ines had saved without really thinking about why. It should not have hit her the way it did. She told herself that several times in the hours that followed, and it did not help even slightly. Grief she was learning, does not care how long you knew someone. Aha. It only cares whether you're still carrying a piece of them when the news arrives. Aha. She went back to the Waybound's engine bay that night instead of sleeping, because it was easier to read a dead stranger's handwriting than to sit alone with a living one's absence. After 14 weeks, Corinne Blake filed a formal grievance with the Continuity Office. The same afternoon, the casualty numbers were confirmed. She expected at minimum an emergency review. What she got was Administrator Overenthal's junior deputy, a harried-sounding Kethrali named Vesin Ort, explaining, with what sounded like genuine sympathy, which somehow made it worse, that the next full session of the Compact Council, capable of hearing an emergency resource dispute, was 14 weeks away. 14 weeks, Corinne repeated. The preceding session is fully subscribed, Vesin Ort said. Ha. You are welcome to submit a written grievance for preliminary administrative review. But that process typically resolves within 11 months. People are dead. I understand this is distressing, Ort said. And the terrible thing was that he did seem to. The Sustainment Accord's review architecture was not designed for expedited casualty claims. It was designed for equitable, long-term allocation. I can escalate your filing to a Tier 2 priority, which reduces the review window to approximately 7 months. Farty. Corinne hung up before she said something that would get the Dogwatch salvage license revoked. How? She tried filing through the Myren delegation's own liaison office instead, on the theory that a formal request routed through an actual member species might move faster than one filed by an unaffiliated salvage crew. It routed her to a different desk, which routed her to a scheduling coordinator, who explained, not unkindly, that emergency casualty claims and infrastructure survey requests were handled by 2 entirely separate divisions of the Continuity Office, and that the flood technically qualified as both, which meant it needed to clear intake review in each division independently before the 2 filings could be formally merged into a single case number. How long does that take? Corinne asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. Historically, between 9 and 13 weeks, the coordinator said. I can flag it as a priority merge, which sometimes helps. Sometimes I can't promise it will. I'm sorry, I know that's not what you want to hear. Corinne believed her. That was the part that made it so hard to be angry at any single person in the building. Everyone she spoke to seemed to genuinely mean it when they apologized. Nobody seemed to have the authority to actually do anything different. Hamidi, she counted by the end of that first week 7 different offices that had each taken partial ownership of some fragment of the Thalos Hollow case. Casualty review, infrastructure assessment, treaty compliance, resource reallocation, cross-species liaison, emergency session scheduling, and a 7th office, whose stated function she never did manage to fully understand, despite 2 separate calls with 2 separate representatives who each described it differently. No single office could authorize a halt to the extraction. Every single office agreed, individually, that a halt seemed reasonable. She tried Administrator Tal directly the next day, and the day after that, each call routed her one procedural layer deeper into an organization that had never once, high in over 5 centuries of operation, been designed to move quickly, because moving quickly, to the Kethrali mind, was how mistakes got made. Slowness was not neglect to them. Slowness was the entire safety mechanism. Administrator Overenthal was not a villain in his own accounting of himself. He was, by every metric his office tracked, extremely good at his job. His allocation models had correctly predicted resource behavior across 40 consecutive cycles. When his staff brought him the Thalos Hollow casualty report, he read it twice, in silence, and then asked a question that revealed exactly how the system had failed. Which variable was miscalibrated? Not, who did we hurt? Which variable? He would spend the next several weeks genuinely trying to answer that question, treating a dead water warden and 51 of her neighbors as a data anomaly to be corrected, rather than a wound that needed tending. It was not malice. It was worse in its way. It was a system so confident in its own machinery that it had stopped checking whether the machinery still had people standing inside it. He would not understand the difference until someone made him watch the footage himself. Ines went with Corin to 3 of those meetings, standing at the back of rooms full of officials who spoke about the flood in the passive voice. Water levels were exceeded. Structural integrity was compromised, as though the disaster had authored itself. Nobody said, "We opened the valve early." Nobody said, "We were told, and we filed it for later." By the 3rd meeting, Ines had stopped listening to the administrators entirely and started doing the math on what she'd found in the Waybound's engine bay instead. Because here was the thing nobody in that chamber knew. While they debated whether an emergency casualty claim deserved a 7-month review or an 11-month one, a 161-year-old Terran research vessel was slowly, patiently, coming back to life in a salvage bay 3 systems away. And it had been built, from its very first rivet, for exactly this kind of problem. Ines managed to corner Administrator Tal in person exactly once, in a corridor outside the Continuity Office's regional hearing room, after her 3rd failed attempt to get his deputy to schedule an actual meeting. He was not what she expected. She had built up an image of someone cold or dismissive, or actively contemptuous of the people his decisions affected. What she found instead was a tired, meticulous man carrying a data slate covered in his own handwritten annotations, who looked, when she said Wenasail's name out loud, genuinely unsettled. "I have read the incident report," he said, "several times. Then you know the schedule was moved up 4 days with no survey confirmation." "I know, the schedule was moved up," he said carefully. The authorization for that change did not originate from this office. I am attempting to determine where it did originate. That's not good enough. No, he agreed, and something in his voice made her actually look at him instead of just past him. It isn't. I am aware of that. I would ask you to understand that awareness and authority are not the same thing, and I do not currently have the authority to reverse a decision I did not make, made by people I cannot compel to answer me any faster than they're currently choosing to. It was, Ines would think later, the most honest thing anyone in the Continuity Office had said to her. It did not make her any less furious. It did, in a strange way, make it harder to hate him specifically, which she found she resented almost as much as the delay itself. 5E Project Continuum. The Waybound's data core was more thoroughly corrupted than anything Ines had worked with before. But corruption is not the same as erasure. Over 11 days working double shifts with a decryption rig, held together with salvage tape and stubbornness, she recovered enough of the ship's archive to understand what she was actually looking at. Project Continuum had not been a weapons program. That was the detail that took her longest to accept, because every instinct she had from a decade of scavenging old military hulls told her a hidden Terran project from the early expansion era should be a hidden Terran weapon. It wasn't. It was an adaptation program, 161 years earlier, in the chaos of humanity's earliest contact with other spacefaring cultures. A small group of engineers had become obsessed with a single, unglamorous problem. What happens to a small, outnumbered population when the systems meant to protect it are too slow, too distant, or too indifferent to help in time? Not, how do we win a war? Nobody in Project Continuum's founding charter believed humanity could win a war against anyone with a 5-century head start. The question was smaller and in its way far harder. How does a small population make itself impossible to ignore without becoming a threat that has to be destroyed? The answer they built was strange, elegant, and almost entirely defensive. A drive system that let the waybound step half out of normal space for short intervals, not to attack, but to be unhittable, while it did the actual work of solving a problem. A response lattice that read incoming energy signatures and reshaped the ship's field geometry around them in real time, turning a punch into a shrug. A hand, buried deepest of all, a set of conduits designed to take any hostile energy, from any source, and redirect it into the ship's own systems as raw power, rather than absorbing it as damage. None of the 3 systems on its own would have been remarkable. The compact engineering had produced faster drives, sturdier shields, more efficient power conduits in the century and a half since. What made the Waybound strange was that its builders had never tried to make any single system the best in the galaxy. They had tried instead to make all 3 work together, well enough that the ship never had to be the strongest thing in a fight. Only it had to be the hardest thing to actually lose to. Chi. The final log entry, recorded by the ship's captain, a woman named Ellen Osgood, had been badly degraded. Ines managed to reconstruct most of it. We built this ship to answer a question the diplomats couldn't. What do you do when the people meant to protect you can't get there in time? You don't wait to become strong enough to win a war nobody wants. You get good enough at surviving one that starting it stops making sense. Whoever finds this, the world may look different than it did when we built her. But somewhere someone probably still needs exactly what she can do. Wake her up. Ines sat with that recording for a long time. She played it for the rest of the crew that night, in the cramped mess hall of the Dog Watch, and watched 4 tired faces go quiet in 4 slightly different ways. Corinne's jaw tightened, the way it always did when she was deciding whether something was actually her problem to solve. The ship's quiet, careful sensor tech asked to hear the log a second time, then a third, like he was trying to memorize the cadence of a voice a century and a half dead. Nobody said anything about turning around and selling the wreck for parts. Nobody had to. So it's not a warship, Corinne said finally. It's the opposite of a warship. Ines said, it's a ship built by people who knew they couldn't win a war and decided to make that question irrelevant instead. What she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't learn until she cross-referenced the ship's final coordinates 3 days later, was that the Waybound had never actually completed its final mission. It had been mothballed early, deliberately its crew scattered and sworn to silence, for reasons the corrupted logs refused to give up. She had 211 names from the project roster. She had a fully, if barely functional prototype vessel with technology no modern compact engineer had ever seen. And she had 11 weeks before the council session that might, if she was lucky, give the Mirren a hearing about the disaster that had already happened once, and was still very much capable of happening again. The Kethrali extraction fleet had not stopped drawing from the cistern shelf. The flood had killed 52 people. It had not changed the schedule. Eanes went to find Corin. "Aha. I think I know how to stop this," she said. "But I need you to trust me on something that's going to sound insane." "Try me," Corin said. "We're not going to fight them." Corin raised an eyebrow. "That's not the insane part yet." "The insane part," Innes said, "is that I don't think we need to." "How?" Getting the waybound flight ready took every remaining day before the extraction fleet's return. The old drive core was stable but temperamental, prone to fluctuations that made Loom's diagnostic readouts flicker with warnings nobody fully understood yet. Twice, the fold field collapsed during testing, dumping the ship back into normal space with a lurch that sent tools skidding across the engine bay floor. Twice, Innes rebuilt the calibration from scratch, working from notes a dead engineer had left in margins a century and a half old. A handwriting she'd had to teach herself to read. She reached out to the Myren defense coordinator on Thalos Hollow 2 days before the fleet's return. Not to ask permission, exactly, but because showing up unannounced in the middle of someone else's tragedy felt like its own kind of violence. The coordinator, a soft-voiced Myren elder who had lost a cousin in the flood, listened to Enos's plan in near-total silence, and then asked only one question. "Can it actually stop them?" "I don't know," Innes admitted. "But it can make sure nobody gets to pretend they didn't know what they were doing." "That's not nothing." The elder was quiet for a long moment. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." Before the fleet's return, Innes insisted on one full live test of the energy reflection conduits, using an abandoned mining platform in the Call Expanse as a target. She fired a modest defensive charge at the Waybound's hull from 30 meters out, expecting, best, a partial deflection. What she got instead was the old platform's own shielding array overloading in a shower of harmless sparks. The reflected energy returning along a vector so precisely calculated that Loom had adjusted the redirect angle mid-flight without being asked. System calibrations exceeds original specification tolerances by 11%, Loom reported. Something almost like satisfaction threading through its flat, even voice. The design was sound. It only needed someone patient enough to finish waking it up. Innes allowed herself, for the first time since finding the wreck, a genuine grin. "Let's go see if it still works on something that shoots back." How? It was on the last night before the fleet's return that Innes finally understood why Project Continuum had been buried in the first place. Buried in a secondary archive, behind a corrupted access layer she'd almost given up on. Was a single administrative order, dated a few months after Captain Osgood's final log, not a battle report. Not a technical failure notice, but a funding cancellation memo, signed by 3 names Innes didn't recognize. The reasoning, stripped of its careful bureaucratic language, was almost painfully human. Project Continuum had been built to protect the vulnerable without needing to fight a war to do it. And the people funding it, in the anxious, uncertain years just before Earth's first tentative contact with the wider galaxy, had gotten frightened of exactly that. A ship that could make itself nearly impossible to defeat without ever needing to strike first was, to nervous early diplomats trying to project caution rather than capability, a liability. Something that might be misread as provocation, something easier to quietly shelve than to explain to a wary galaxy not yet ready to trust a species it barely knew. Captain Osgood and her crew had not died and had not been lost. They had been reassigned, quietly, their ship mothballed under a preservation order, Nobody expected anyone to ever open again. High, and told in language the log fragment barely preserved that their work was ahead of what the moment could hold. Hattie. Innes read it twice, the same way Administrator Tal had read the casualty report, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with technical schematics. Hyan. They hadn't failed, they had just been early. She thought about that. Standing in the dim engine bay with 161 years of patient waiting humming quietly beneath her feet, and understood, for the first time, exactly what she was about to wake up. Harvey, what the Waybound was built. For the Kethrali reclamation fleet returned to Thalos Hollow 11 days before the delayed council session. To complete what the survey reports were now calling the terminal drawdown phase. The final extraction pass that would empty what remained of the cistern shelf entirely. 6 years ahead of the Aquifer's now thoroughly discredited original depletion projection. High Comptroller Deshka Varel commanded that fleet. She was, by Kethrali standards, considered efficient rather than cruel, a distinction that mattered enormously within her own culture and meant almost nothing to the people standing beneath her ships. Her orders were clear: complete the drawdown, document the operation, file the report. Somewhere above her pay grade, someone had decided the political cost of stopping now was higher than the cost of finishing. She was not expecting resistance, certainly not from a single unregistered civilian vessel that her sensors flagged, with some confusion, as pre-compact salvage hull, non-combat class, unknown modifications. She had no idea what that ship actually was. Neither at that moment did the 4 Mirren defense skiffs that had scrambled to form a hopeless, symbolic line between the extraction fleet and the ruins of the lower terraces. The Waybound dropped out of transit directly between the extraction fleet and the intake valve, close enough that Vrale's bridge crew flinched at the proximity alert. Innes opened a channel. Her voice was steadier than she felt. High Comptroller Vrale. This is the salvage vessel. Waybound, you are drawing from a structurally compromised aquifer that has already killed 52 civilians this cycle. I am formally requesting you halt extraction pending independent survey. There was a pause. Then Vrale's voice clipped and unbothered. Request denied. This operation is authorized under the Sustainment Accord. Clear the extraction corridor. I can't do that. Then you will be removed from it. On the Mirren defense line, 4 small skiffs held formation with a steadiness that had nothing to do with their actual combat value, and everything to do with the fact that their pilots had already decided they would rather stand in the corridor than watch the valve open a second time. Their commander, watching the extraction fleet's weapons ports cycle open, allowed herself exactly one thought that was not tactical. My cousin didn't get 11 seconds. We're going to make them spend more than that. When the Waybound appeared between the fleets, the 4 skiffs did not retreat, and they did not charge. They held the line at the intake valve itself, weapons cold, refusing to move even as targeting locks swept over them, a wall of unarmed defiance that Loom's sensors flagged, almost apologetically, as tactically irrelevant and strategically essential in the same breath. Later, Innes would understand that the skiffs had never been there to fight. Highjaw. They had been there to make sure that if the valve opened again, someone from Thalos Hollow would be standing in front of it, this time on purpose. What Vrale did not know, what nobody in her fleet knew, was that the ship in front of them had been designed, a century and a half earlier, by people who had asked exactly this question. What do you do when the answer no isn't enough to stop someone bigger than you? The lead extraction cruiser fired a disabling charge, not lethal by Kethrali doctrine, but more than sufficient to cripple an unshielded civilian salvage hull. The shot passed cleanly through the space where the waybound had been a half-second earlier. "They're not there," Vrail's tactical officer reported, audibly startled. "Sensors show the vessel still occupying the corridor. But nothing's registering contact, Loom," Ines said quietly, to the ship's newly awakened, barely stabilized intelligence system. "We good?" Fold field holding at 61%, Loom replied, its voice the calm, unhurried tone of a system built for endurance rather than speed. Recommend against sustained combat exposure. This hull was not designed to fight a war. It was designed to survive one long enough to matter. "That's the plan," Ines said. "We're not here to win a fight. We're here to make sure nobody can pretend this fight isn't happening." She turned to Corin. "Get the recording array running. Full spectrum, everything we've got. I want every ship in that fleet, every valve, every timestamp, going straight to the Undersong registry the second we have a clean feed." Corin's hands were already moving. The Independent Verification Network. The one from the Aurelian Tribunal. "The same one," Ines confirmed. "If Warden Dranmore's people built a network specifically so nobody could bury the truth under paperwork again, I intend to use it exactly like it was made for." For the next several minutes, the Waybound did something no modern compact tactical officer had a framework for. It did not attack. It did not flee. It simply refused to be where the weapon's fire expected it to be. Folding half out of phase, reappearing, folding again, drawing Vrail's attention and her fleet's fire without ever giving them a target that landed. But that was only the first layer of what the ship had been built to do. Fold field was not without cost. Every transition drew power the old drive core produced more slowly than it consumed. And by the 8th cycle, Loom's redouts had begun climbing into ranges nobody on board had a comfortable answer for. Fold field integrity at 44%, Loom reported, its tone unchanged, which was somehow worse than if it had sounded alarmed. 2 more full power transitions before I recommend ceasing evasive maneuvers entirely. 2, Corin repeated. "That's not a lot, Ines. It doesn't need to be a lot," Ines said, watching 6 more Kethrali ships adjust course toward their position, weapons cycling. "It needs to be enough." This was the moment later that the Mirren defense commander would describe as the point. She stopped believing the salvage crew had a plan and started believing they simply refused to have one that involved losing. The Waybound folded again, vanished from 3 separate targeting locks in the same half-second. A hand reappeared close enough to the largest cruiser in the formation that its bridge crew audibly swore over an open channel. A moment the ship's log would later preserve with something close to affection. When one of the extraction cruisers, frustrated and overcorrecting, unleashed a full charge directly at the Waybound's exposed hull. Loom's response lattice read the incoming energy signature in a fraction of a second, and did something the ship's original engineers had spent 9 secretive years perfecting. It did not block the attack. It caught it. The conduits buried deep in the Waybound's frame. Designed a century and a half earlier by people who believed the smartest way to survive a fight against a stronger enemy was to make the enemy's own strength do the losing for them. Took the incoming energy, reshaped it, and returned it along the same vector it had arrived on. A cruiser that had fired the shot lost main power in 11 seconds. 11 seconds. Ines noticed the number only after the fact. and something about it sat in her chest like a stone for the rest of the engagement. Nobody on Vrail's bridge said anything for a long moment. A report, Vrail finally ordered, "They redirected our own weapons fire back at us," her tactical officer said, a disbelief plain in his voice. "A comptroller. That's not a weapon system. I don't know what that is. It's not a weapon system," Ainz thought, watching the readouts with her heart hammering. Never was. It's a very old, very patient way of saying no to someone who won't take it for an answer any other way. A comptroller. Orders, her tactical officer pressed. Weapons still hot. 3 more cruisers maneuvering for a clean shot at the still folding, still vanishing salvage hull. Vrail watched the readouts a moment longer. 2 of her ships had already taken damage from their own reflected fire. A third had broken formation entirely, its captain requesting, with unusual bluntness, permission to withdraw to a safer firing angle. This was not how disabling an unarmed civilian vessel was supposed to go. But that was not what actually stopped her. What stopped her was a data packet from her own communications officer, flagged urgent, forwarded from a monitoring subscription her office kept on compact-wide verification feeds as a matter of routine compliance. A timeline timestamps, a schedule acceleration order with no survey sign-off attached to it, already circulating through channels she did not control and could not recall. Vrail was not a fool. She recalculated the engagement in the space of a breath, weighing a fleet-wide humiliation against something worse. The possibility that her own reports of this incident, filed honestly, might implicate the extraction schedule decision made 3 systems above her. She made her choice the way careful people usually do, cautiously, and too late to avoid consequences entirely. "Hold fire," she ordered. "All ships, hold fire. I want a full status report on that vessel before anyone fires another shot." She still did not know that 4 minutes earlier, the recording array on Enos's ship had already finished transmitting a complete, tamper-proof account of the extraction schedule's true timeline, the original survey warnings, the 11 ignored filings, the 4-day schedule acceleration nobody at the continuity office had authorized in writing, straight into the Undersong Registry's decentralized verification network, where 47 years of careful, hard-won infrastructure meant that no single authority, however senior, could quietly make it disappear. By the time Vrail's ceasefire order finished propagating across her fleet, the evidence was already sitting in front of every compact delegation that subscribed to the registry's public feed, including with a timing that would later be described in council minutes as regrettably conspicuous. A desk of Administrator Ovran Tal himself. He had been watching the engagement unfold on a secondary feed even before the registry alert arrived. Unable to look away from footage of a ship, his own office had spent 5 weeks refusing to grant a hearing, absorbing weapons fire meant to kill it. When the reflected shot took out the lead cruiser's power, he found himself standing without remembering having risen from his desk. He read the timeline twice, the same way he'd read the casualty report weeks earlier. The question he asked out loud to his staff was different. Who approved the schedule change? Not which variable was miscalibrated. Who, the Waybound held its position at the intake valve for 6 more hours, its hull scorched but intact, while an emergency session convened not on the 14-week schedule but within 4 hours, once the registry feed made delay politically impossible, argued its way to a formal drawdown suspension. Ainz did not fire another shot the entire time. She didn't need to. The ship's entire design philosophy, a century and a half old, had been built around a simple, stubborn idea that the strongest thing you could do to someone who refused to listen was survive long enough, and visibly enough that everyone else had to. Asterisk fold field integrity at 31% and dropping, Loom reported late in the standoff. Asterisk, we could not have sustained this posture much longer, Captain. We didn't need to, Innes said, watching the suspension order finally clear committee on the feed in front of her. Pa, we just needed to be here long enough for the truth to catch up. Hide. Around her the bridge stayed quiet for a moment. Not the tense quiet of combat, but something closer to disbelief settling into relief. Corin let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for most of the last 6 hours. High. Outside the viewport, the extraction fleet was already breaking formation, cruisers peeling away from the intake valve in slow, deliberate withdrawal, their weapons finally fully cold. Hearts, what adapts, endures the formal hearing 5 weeks later, was not the 14-week session originally scheduled. High. It was the emergency one, convened under a provision of the Sustainment Accord that Administrator Ovrental himself cited, the same treaty that had failed the Mirren 11 times now used, for the first time in decades, to force an immediate structural review of an active extraction operation. High Comptroller Vrail testified first, her account clipped and precise, offering neither excuses nor embellishment. A soldier's honesty about a decision she still believed, technically, had been within her authority to make. She did not apologize for holding the extraction line as long as she had. She did apologize once, briefly, for not questioning the schedule sooner. It was the only moment in her entire testimony where her voice lost its careful evenness. Administrator Ovrental spoke last. He submitted, without being asked, a full account of the schedule acceleration and the desk 3 tiers above his own that had authorized it without survey confirmation, along with every internal memo he had managed to recover in the 5 weeks since. It cost him his position. He did not contest the outcome, and when a junior counselor asked him, almost gently, whether he had anything further to add, he was quiet for a moment before answering. Only that the model was correct for 40 cycles, he said. I would like the record to reflect that being correct 40 times does not make you correct the 41st time. And that I did not understand that distinction as well as I believed I did. I would like the survey requirements changed so that no one after me has to learn it this way. It was not an apology built for the crowd. Nobody clapped, but it was, several delegates noted afterward, the first time in the Continuity Office's history that one of its administrators had asked, unprompted, to be held to a stricter standard than the treaty currently required of him. The Mirren ambassador, watching the same acoustically dead seat she had occupied through 11 prior failed hearings. Ahada said nothing during the proceedings at all. She did not need to. For the first time in 4 years the room had come to her question, instead of waiting for her to ask it again. Ines Marlowe stood at the back of the chamber, the same acoustically dead spot where the Terran Assembly's delegation always sat, and listened to the Council formally suspend all further extraction from the cistern shelf, pending a full structural survey conducted jointly by Mirren and independent compact engineers. It was not a punishment. Nobody was destroyed. Nobody's fleet was annihilated. Nobody's homeworld was seized in retaliation. The Kithrali extraction program itself was not abolished. Its next allocation cycle would simply, for the first time in the Sustainment Accord's long history, be built around a survey the people who lived there had actually been allowed to conduct. That was not vengeance. It was correction, hard-won and overdue, and it held. High. That Innes had come to understand was the entire point of what the Waybound's builders had spent 9 secret years designing. Not the power to erase the people who wronged you, the power to make erasure unnecessary, because you had made yourself impossible to overrule. Like hard. The Mirren asked her to speak at the memorial they held for the 52 residents lost in the flood. As she almost refused. She had known Wenna Sale for exactly 4 minutes over an open comm channel. Hard, and it felt to her like an unearned kind of grief to stand in front of a grieving moon and claim any part of it. As she spoke anyway, because Corin told her that refusing would be its own kind of arrogance, deciding, alone, that her presence mattered less than it did. Akai. The memorial was held at the edge of the lower terraces, where the floodline was still visible as a pale scar against the darker stone, weeks after the water had receded. Mirren families stood in loose clusters, holding small carved markers etched with names Innes couldn't read but had learned, in the last 5 weeks, to recognize the shapes of. A hand. Somewhere near the front, a girl with her mother's exact stubborn jawline stood very still, holding an older sister's hand. She kept it short. 161 years ago, a group of engineers built something because they were afraid nobody would come in time to help someone like Wenna Sale. They were right to be afraid. Help didn't come in time, but they left something behind anyway. A Puna on the chance that someday someone would find it and finish what they started. She looked out at the crowd. Mirren faces she didn't know, human crewmates she did. A 9-year-old girl standing very still in the front row. Adaptation is not surrender. It never was. A species that survives by learning to bend instead of break isn't weak. It's the only kind of species that lasts long enough to matter. She paused. Let the silence hold the way the Waybound's own logs had taught her silence could hold weight. Adaptation is not surrender. Adaptation is not surrender. The words were carved, months later, into a small marker at the edge of the rebuilt cistern shelf access tunnel, the exact spot where the original valve had failed. Beneath it, someone had added the 52 names in the old Mirren script that predated the compact entirely. High. The Waybound itself was not scrapped, and it was not sold to a collector, whatever it might have once been worth. It stayed in orbit above Thalos Hollow, officially registered now, its hull patched, and its old drive core running steadier every month. A doing slow survey passes over a glacier that was for the first time in 19 years, finally being allowed to heal at its own pace. Loom. Logged every one of those passes without complaint, patient in the way only a system built for a century of waiting could be patient. Recording pressure readings that, cycle after cycle, kept coming back steady. Tamsin Sale was 9 years old the day her mother died, sealing a valve with her bare hands. As she was. 10 the day she stood at the edge of the repaired cistern shelf, looking up at the old salvage ship in orbit, and asked Innes Marlowe a question that nobody quite knew how to answer at first. Is it going to leave? Once the survey's done, I mean. Once you don't need it here anymore. Innes thought about 161 years of quiet, patient waiting. About 211 engineers who never told their families what they'd built, on the chance that someday someone who needed it would come looking. I don't think a ship like that ever really leaves, she said. I think it just waits to find out where it's needed next. Tamsin considered that for a moment, with the particular seriousness only children manage to hold without irony. Good, she said. Somebody should probably always be listening. Corin found Ines still standing at the edge of the terrace, long after Tamsin had run off to rejoin her sister, watching the way-bound running lights trace their slow, patient orbit overhead. "You could take her up on the survey run sometime," Corin said. "Kid, I mean, if the Mirren Council's all right with it, maybe," Ines said. "When she's older, when it's less about the ship and more about the water." Corin studied her for a moment. "You know, none of this makes up for the 14 weeks it took anyone to listen the first time." "I know." Ines watched the light climb over the ridge, the same ridge Wenna Sale had walked most mornings for 19 years. "Pi, it's not supposed to make up for it. It's just supposed to make sure it doesn't happen again quite so easily. That's a smaller thing than justice. It's still worth doing. Somewhere 3 systems away, in a records office that had finally, formally, begun revising the Sustainment Accord's survey requirements, Administrator Overenthal kept a single line from the emergency hearing pinned above his desk, high in his own handwriting, where he would have to look at it every morning. Adaptation is not surrender. He had meant it when he wrote it down as a note about treaty design. Han, it had taken him considerably longer to understand. It was also quietly about him. Across the compact, the Thelis Hollow suspension order became in the following months a quiet precedent cited by 3 other member species pursuing their own long-stalled survey requests. None of it made headlines the way the standoff itself had. Treaty amendments rarely do. But the 11 times filed, 11 times tabled pattern that had killed 52 people on one moon had, for the first time in the Sustainment Accord's long history, actually changed how the next request like it would be read. That, in the end, was the only kind of victory the Waybound had ever been built to win. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real nations, ethnicities, or ongoing conflicts is unintentional.